Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. You know, in the past 50 years, scientists have mapped the entire human genome and eradicated smallpox. And here in the U.S., infant mortality rates and the death from heart disease have fallen by roughly 70%, and the average American has gained almost a decade of life. Climate change was recognized as an existential threat. The internet was invented. On the problem of poverty, though, according to sociologist and Princeton professor Matthew Desmond, in his provocative and compelling new book on the subject of poverty, there has been no real improvement, just a long stasis. Trying to graph the share of Americans living in poverty over the past half-century amounts to drawing a line that resembles gently rolling hills. The line curves up and then slightly down and then back up again over the years through Republican and Democratic administrations, notwithstanding a couple of grim economic recessions, a couple of declared wars on poverty, and a pandemic. What accounts for this lack of progress in trying to solve the problem of poverty in America, and specifically here in California for that matter? Professor Desmond's book is called Poverty by America, where he reimagines the debate on poverty in America, offering what he calls a new way of thinking about a morally urgent problem. And while it is not my job to promote books on this podcast, I thought Professor Desmond's themes and assumptions on the issue were compelling enough and worthy of debate and discussion that for this edition of Then There's California, I decided to copy and paste them into a more micro conversation about the dynamics of the poverty issue here in California. And so I had the audacity to give a reading assignment of diving into Professor Desmond's theories and exclamations on poverty to two distinguished elected officials who represent California's state capital city of Sacramento on both the state and local level, and whose life journeys and policy priorities impact and help define and guide the challenges of dealing with poverty, not only in Sacramento, but also have an impact across the state. State Senator Angelique Ashby represents California's 8th Senate District, including the city of Sacramento and parts of Sacramento County. Senator Ashby was Sacramento City Council member for more than 10 years, and for a large part of her city council term, she was the only woman member of the council. And her personal story is both familiar and inspiring to many in Northern California, being a single mom at age 20, living on food stamps and in affordable housing, and depending on subsidized childcare. And we last spoke to Senator Ashby on this podcast in December, right after her swearing in as the new member of the class of 2023, and she's here with us now. We're glad to have her back. Senator Ashby, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And we are also very privileged to have joining us the mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg. He has been serving as mayor since 2016. Before becoming mayor, Darrell Steinberg served as an assembly member and ultimately in the Senate as the Senate Pro Tem. He authored the Mental Health Services Act. He, somewhere in between, founded the Steinberg Institute, which today has become the leading voice on mental health policy and legislation in California. He was my boss when he was in the Senate, and I'm glad to have him here. Welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Well, it's so great to be with you, Brian. It brings back the old times, and to be with my senator, Senator Ashby, this is a real treat.
Well, we're really glad to have you both here. Thank you for indulging me on the interest in the themes of this book. I read this and I thought, how do I talk about this on a podcast? And then I thought of both of you. It wasn't that I expected you to look at the book and go, wow, this is the most profound thing I've ever read. I'll let you put on your book reviewers hats. What did you think of it?
Well, I have a degree in sociology from UC Davis, and it is so similar to the books that you read when you work on that kind of degree at a university like that. It's I would not recommend it to anybody who is already feeling very down. This is not a book about optimism. The author points out a lot of things that are really problematic in our society and have been for a long time, and dwells a bit on the lack of progress in some areas. That being said, my life is a lot about what he talks about here. He talks about being on food stamps. He talks about living in low-income housing. He talks about being a woman and what access to abortion means and doesn't mean. And, you know, I was a young single mom on food stamps in this town. And what I would like to say to people who might read this book or might hear the mayor and I talking today is that where I disagree with the author a bit is that he likens poverty to racism or sexism, but I don't think that's true. Poverty is not a state of permanency. It is not like your ethnicity. It is not like things that you carry with you your whole life. Poverty can be a temporary state, and it is something that you move through. And it is something that when you live in an amazing state like California, you can seek out a lot of help for. There's a huge social network. What I love about this podcast today is that I'm a brand new senator, but I'm sitting in Mayor Steinberg's old Senate seat. And there are very few examples of people who have come through the legislature who've done more than him. His name is literally hanging on the walls in the Kennedy Center for a profile and courage for his work on mental health, something this book doesn't touch much on, mental health and drug addiction. But this state of California does so much to try to address the needs of people in poverty or who are hurting. And I look to those things as the optimism for the future.
Mayor, what do you think about that?
Well, I thought it was very well written, but in some ways, it only said and articulated what has been the reality of America and in some respects the world for many, many centuries, because there has always been an economic divide. And in this country, I think our greatest challenge, and even in our state, our greatest challenge is the continuing economic divide. And so I am not a democratic socialist, though I respect those who call themselves that. And I believe in capitalism tempered by assertive government. I believe in capitalism because I think there always needs to be an incentive to create jobs, to grow, because that's the only way real economic opportunity is had. But it must be tempered by assertive governmental intervention to try to change what in reality is generational poverty for so many people. One stark example, the Congress, during the Build Back Better, I believe that was the chapter, passes a historic child tax credit that reduces poverty dramatically by all accounts. It sunsets after 1 year. And because of the change in the political power in Congress, it's going to be a while before that can be brought back again. Real life example of moving the needle. And you're right, Senator Ashby, California does it in a myriad of ways.
Well, to your point, the author, Professor Desmond, reminds us that the stasis that he's referring to is not because we as a nation in a state have stopped trying to solve the problem of poverty, but that decade after decade, the amount of money is short-lived, or it's out there, but it's not used for the purpose, that it doesn't actually trickle down, so to speak, to those who need it most. And then it's used oftentimes with free will by local governments, by cities and counties and states, for purposes that it really wasn't intended. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, he definitely points out that it's not for lack of investment, but rather how those dollars are spent. Points to a few examples.
A leaky bucket, he calls it.
Right.
Yeah.
Points to a few high-profile examples of wealthy people being paid with like AFDC funding and funding that's supposed to go to families, young single moms, and instead is paying a motivational speaker who's a former quarterback, that kind of stuff. And that's definitely true. That's the plight of every good elected official, is to try to plug up the holes in the bucket. And we do it through audits, and we do it through trying to be surgical in our approach about how we move those dollars through. And there's just no doubt that intergenerational poverty is real, that people pass on their wealth in a variety of ways. Sometimes that's educationally. I was the first person in my family to go to law school. And I remember being surrounded by people who had parents that were lawyers. That was definitely an advantage for them. I had no one to ask about law school or what a tort was until I just had to live through it. Now I could help my children and grandchildren, but there's something about that generational opportunity, whether it's academic or owning a house or starting a business. And this is why the mayor and I both are big proponents of programs that create additional opportunities for communities historically left behind. That's where there's a real opportunity, I think, to change the dynamic and to change the story.
I mean, those who believe, like we do, that government has a proper role and an important role to help alleviate poverty must acknowledge that government is not always as efficient as it could or should be. And it's our job. We shouldn't leave it to those who don't believe in government to insist that government always perform better. It is on us. And so getting the money in the hands of working families in a direct way without delay, getting affordable housing built. How about that for a challenge in California, in the country? The amount of time it takes between the idea for a necessary project and people actually moving in can be years at great expense. It's our challenge, I think, to use technology, to use innovation, to be thinking about how it is we apply many of the things that have become groundbreaking in the technology, in the healthcare, and the medical field, and apply it to government around effectiveness and efficiency and outcomes, because that's what will, I think, give people the confidence that investing more in anti-poverty programs is worth it.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what government can do and what each member of that government can do. And I like to use the local as an example. Mayor and I both have talked about the structure of governance in the city of Sacramento for a long time. There's a certain expectation placed on the shoulders of the mayor, but it doesn't actually correlate with the amount of decision-making authority that the mayor has. The average person who's going to step into that seat as mayor is going to struggle. They're going to constantly hit a wall between what the people are asking them to do and what is possible from that position on the dais. And that's one thing that I think, we really have to talk about openly as a society if we ever want to get to our real goals.
Well, put it a different way. Often when I talk to young people about the system, I always quote the old Churchill line that, democracy is the worst form of government with the exception of every other form of government. And what that really means is that democracy is necessary and it's right, because having a despot, we've seen what that leads to too often. On the other hand, we pay a price for all the checks and balances in the system. You think about what it takes to get a bill passed in the legislature. What, on average, 6-7 committees, 2 floors, and then you could work 9-10 months and a governor could say, nice idea, but I ain't signing that. Then you're back to scratch. Well, what does that mean when you're pursuing an important anti-poverty measure? It means that it takes incredible persistence to get that through. Now, it's not just about, as the senator says, about any particular individual, but systemically, I think we have to ask ourselves, where does the sclerosis in the system exist in ways that we can heal and make better so that more good things happen while we have the checks and balances? And, there's a whole host of things, campaign finance reform, and making it easier or more likely that the people who often are underrepresented, don't have as much of a voice, get their say, and we achieve more progress on their behalf.
One question I'm thinking of, as you have moved from local government to state government now, and having now to think bigger picture beyond just what happens in the 1st District in Sacramento, you, by extension, you were in city council, then you became state senator, Senate pro tem, looking at the state of California, not just Sacramento, and now you're back to a Sacramento-centric focus, but you're part of this coalition of mayors from all over the state.
Yes.
How has that affected your thinking and your policy direction on this issue of poverty?
Well, certainly as mayor of the city, I have seen it and I feel it up close. I get asked all the time, which job do you like better? And I love both of them, but I love being a legislator. That's honest. And in part because you have the ability to sort of think big and to put forward the policy prescription. You have some responsibility for follow through. That's the oversight role of the legislature. But in local government, you are responsible for the actual outcomes. And so homelessness is a great example, of course, the issue of our time and the issue that dominates so much of the public discourse. I mean, I authored the Mental Health Services Act in California. It's $4 billion a year. I often joke if I knew back in '04 that I was going to run for mayor in 2016, I might have written it differently and had some of the money go to the cities. But who knew? Because at the local level, I'm responsible, or at least seen as responsible, for actually making the city feel, look safer and healthier, and helping a lot of people along the way. So it's a very, very different experience. One isn't better than the other. They're both important, but it's when the local government and the state governments work closely together that you get the best results.
I'm probably more comfortable in the implementation space because it's what I've done the most and something I got pretty good at. But I'm stretching. I'm in my stretch here to become a person who can put forward some big policies. You know, one of my big ones, my biggest one that I'm carrying this year, is to make college debt-free for foster youth. Well, it's hard to think of something that could address poverty more. 50% of our homeless individuals say that they are former foster youth. Foster youth say in high school at about a 93% ratio that they would like to go to college and obtain a 4-year degree, but only 4% of them do. If we can reach populations that have the most barriers to success earlier in their life, I think we can really be more effective in what we're doing. That's me moving from being a local implementer who would receive dollars to backing up to say, how can I provide resources out into the world that will result in people having a better opportunity at being successful? And a word I like to use a lot is agency. How do we give people agency over their own life? And I think things like education, literacy, employment, those are the ways that we create pathways that maybe aren't really there right now for folks.
I want to bring up the elephant in the room here, that we are three white people talking about an issue that not just in Sacramento but statewide affects many people of color. Talk about this issue of the impact of poverty statewide and your perspective representing Sacramento, Senator, and also Mr. Mayor, about the communities of color that are impacted even more deeply on this poverty issue.
Sure. I think that we both have had the just incredible opportunity to be selected by one of the most diverse communities really in the entire country. And I can't tell you what a privilege that is. We've walked together out in this community many times. And if you walk through my old city council district, you won't find the same ethnicity 3 doors in a row on any street that you go onto. And what a privilege that is to have people from a myriad of backgrounds look to you and say, there's something about you that I relate to enough that I think you'll do a good job representing me, whether that's as mayor or council member or assembly member or senator. And we've both had those opportunities. I think what's undeniable about racism or being black or brown in the United States of America is that it is intergenerational, that the discrimination goes back a long way, whether that is the whole Black Wall Street discussion or homeownership and redlining, and a very ugly history here in our own city around redlining in certain communities. And how that affects the generations that are farther out is something that I think we're seeking as a state in particular to really address right now. But I have been poor, and poverty is not so limited as to one group or segment of society. I know what it's like to use food stamps. I know the insecurity that it feels like to walk up to a counter and hand them over to a clerk. I know what it is to sit in a welfare office and it's cold and dark and lonely, and to have a little kid on my lap and be trying to figure out how to get medical coverage for him so that I can take care of him once I couldn't provide that on my own. I know what those feelings feel like. I know what it is to be housing insecure or food insecure as an adult with a child that I'm responsible for. And I think that those feelings are transferable.
Mr. Mayor, you've had an incredible couple of years dealing with this issue, but particularly the divides and disparities with poverty, too.
For me, this has been tremendous, but it has been painful at times. And in part, I've been the mayor, and Senator Ashby was the vice mayor during the rightful racial reckoning, around George Floyd. And we had our own very controversial shooting in our city with Stephon Clark. And I will tell you, I have tried, and I'm different now. I'm the same, but I'm different. I'm the same person, same values. I'm the same progressive guy that, that I was seen as pro tem. And also, if I'm going to be honest about it, as mayor, I'm a middle-aged white male and the leader of the establishment. And so I know that I have been seen somewhat differently, especially by younger people from communities of color. And it has forced me to look inside and to try to dig a little bit deeper and to recognize that I have a long way to go in terms of my own understanding and education. I remember one instance after the Stephon Clark shooting where in a talk with young African Americans, I invoked Dr. King's name in the course of my conversation, and I was shouted down for doing so because that's old, right? Even though I love Dr. King and revere, and I think the lessons of organizing and social action are still very, very relevant today, it wasn't as relevant to the young people. And so I think it's on all of us to understand our own limitations, our own need for growth. I will say this, though, get it back to poverty for a moment. Poverty is certainly not limited to people of color or communities of color, but there's no question that people of color are disproportionately impacted by poverty. And Senator Ashby talked about some of the history. It's undeniable. The redlining in Sacramento, it's why neighborhoods were divided. Now, I know reparations is going to be a challenge in terms of how to actually implement it. And I've seen price tags and all that, but what a tremendous opportunity.
Agreed.
To actually look at how to create genuine justice around not just the original sin of slavery, but so much of what has happened in California and in this country over the course of our history. We must invest directly in disadvantaged neighborhoods and in its people. In Sacramento, I think one of the things that has changed over the past, it's not just my mayorship, it's really over the last 15 years or so. The city has changed to some degree. We are still the municipal corporation that is absolutely responsible first and foremost to providing those basic services, including public safety. But a growing city and a city that rightfully reckons with its past also needs to be so much more. We need to invest directly in the forgotten commercial corridors of our city and those small businesses, in young people, in workforce development and career pathways, in affordable housing. The role of a city, of a modern city, a growing city now is changing in real time, and yet the governance of the city and even the finances of the city sort of are based on an old model. And how we reconcile all of that is going to be the great challenge, not just for me and the remainder of my tenure, but for future leaders of the city.
I had a front row seat to the Darrell Steinberg mayor years for a long time. And I also had a front row seat to the mayor before him. But there's something about him that connects to people in a very different way. And I could give you dozens of examples, but I've watched him cry with the mom of a fallen police officer. I have watched him sit on a curbside with family of a homeless person and just listen. I have watched people get so angry that they would break parts of City Hall, windows, monitors, doors. I've seen him bring them together and just work at it over and over until you get to a point of consensus and a pathway forward. And I've had the opportunity to learn from him, and I think many people in Sacramento have, and it's made an entire generation of elected leaders a little bit better. So my personal experiences help me be relatable, but my experiences being mentored by people like him make me effective with the experiences that I've had and then the opportunity that I'm sitting in right now.
I know there's an exploitation issue, an issue of people who are in poverty trying to move up and constantly being pushed down and put down by fees and attitudes and deeper structural forces at play in this. Paying rent, accessing housing, accessing credit, securing a sustainable wage, penalties on top of penalties. There's a vulnerability and an exploitation. And James Baldwin, I think he's quoted in this book, it's expensive to be poor. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, having lived through this myself, it is, right? And there are things that can happen to you when you're already struggling that have a piling on effect. So, for example, and he talks about this quite a bit in the book, predatory lenders. I don't like cash checking places that they'll give you your salary 2 weeks early, but with an interest rate that is so unaffordable. And I've been there. I've used that service before. It is never worth it. You got to find another way. There are other examples. I think it should be illegal to have a 20% interest rate on a credit card, and then also walk out onto college campuses and offer those cards with that crazy fee to young people who are just getting started. And so I do think that there are structures in place that need to be criticized and that need to be looked at very carefully and scrutinized for what they do. Let me give you an example. If you drive through North Natomas, which is largely seen as a new, nice, middle-class neighborhood, would you agree?
Yes, I would.
You will not find a check cashing. You will not. There is not one there. If you drive through Del Paso Heights, which is an area that the city got from the county, so the county's standards on development were already lower. There are already no streetlights. There are already no sidewalks. The city has worked very hard to try to go back and implement higher standards of just infrastructure in that community. But you will find check cashing on every major thoroughfare, sometimes 2 or 3 in a row. What you won't find are banks or Starbucks. You won't find that kind of investment in those communities. Mayor and I talk about this all the time. What is the difference between some of these neighborhoods in our city? And it's always the same thing. Strong, devout, unwavering leadership and deep, intentional investment. Those two things make the difference. And when you drive the 5 minutes it takes to get from the zip code that is North Natomas to the zip code that is Strawberry Manor, your life expectancy drops 10 years based on what you can access there. Farmers markets or safe outdoor spaces, the school districts themselves. And so how do we remedy for that in one city? Well, part of it is what resources does the state make available to the decision makers in the city? And so, yeah, there are definitely structural deficiencies that need to be addressed across the state of California.
The system is stacked, and it perpetuates itself by generation unless we have intentionality about changing it. And that's why direct, smart investments in neighborhoods and in people that too often have been left behind and left out is the only answer. And it's not just the government, it's the private sector as well. You know, major credit union in the city now is talking about locating a major branch in North Sacramento, in that part of North Sacramento that Senator Ashby just talked about. That will be a big move and a big decision. And that's the only way that we overcome. I think one thing we have not talked about is public education. And certainly that's where you see from the very beginning the advantage and disadvantage gap in reality. And I've often said about public education that we need to stress high standards for every child in every school. But I want us to adopt, I've said this for a long time, some form of the European model where we are actually educating and training young people as early as the 8th, 9th, and 10th grades for high-wage careers. We do it as a one-off. We've got academies, but we have not really integrated the job sectors, especially on the private side, and our public education system in a way where every young person has a pathway that leads them to a high-wage job. There are too many 20-year-olds who even if they have their high school diploma, have no idea what they're going to do in their lives because they haven't been presented with those pathways early in life to get excited about a career. It could be a trade, but it could be a so-called white-collar profession as well. There are so many things we can do, not just to invest directly with money, but also to change systems in a way that could be transformative.
I agree with him, but I might take it back even one step farther. I'll take it to a 9-year-old because California doesn't do well in third grade reading rates. Our literacy is some of the lowest in the country for adults and for third grade readers, which is where we test people. And then when you look in our jails and prisons and you look at the incarcerated population, 70% of them read at a third grade or lower level. There is something about having access to education. And, you know, we think of that as a classroom with a teacher, but it's so much more than that. FEU one time told me that the number of young people at Burbank High School in South Sacramento who have never seen the river was over 80%.
Yes.
Now, we live at the confluence of two rivers. There is no excuse for young people to have not had an opportunity to just even be in nature that way in Sacramento, and yet it is a truth.
And it reminds me how many people in Southern California, young people, have never been to the beach.
Never been to the beach,
yes,
right?
So indeed.
And so education is so much bigger than a classroom. It is about public libraries. It is about books. It is about imagination. It is about nature. It's about experiences. And when those are so limited from the time that you're just even 9 years old all the way through being 20 and a young adult, then the world starts to narrow on you. And so do your opportunities.
That's what poverty is. Or at least that's what poverty does, unless there's intentionality by community, by government, by wise business leaders to change that.
Final question, which gets actually to one of the provocative thoughts that I found in this book, which compelled me to think this is worth some more discussion, is the author's feeling that poverty persists because many of us benefit from it and many of us help to create and uphold these obstacles through enriching ourselves by impoverishing others, whether it's ordering from Amazon or going to a fast food restaurant that pays their staff substandard wages. We're all guilty of it, I guess, but he wants us to be poverty abolitionists, to think about how we conduct our lives in terms of keeping poverty alive. What's your perspective on that as parents, as human beings, as lawmakers?
Well, I did see that argument, and then I noticed you can buy this book on Amazon. You know, here's my thought. And you know what? I think this is kind of the answer you want from every person who's in elected office right now. I want to reject that because I have hope. I have hope for everyday people. I have hope for our elected officials. I have hope for the mayors. The mayor and I both have a ton of young mentees who are just stepping into leadership roles on city councils and in school boards. And I look at them and my heart swells with pride thinking about what they'll be able to achieve. Yes, we need to be more intentional about what we do and how we spend our dollars, but that's not new to this country. We've seen that before. We've seen it when Nike was making shoes in China and we wanted people to have jobs in the United States and we've had this conversation over and over and over in this country about intentionality. And yes, there is a constant need to remind yourself to make decisions that effectuate the outcomes that we all want to see in this world. But we also need hope. And I know it's audacious, but if we're not in that space, we shouldn't be leaders because you can't lead from this level of pessimism. You have to lead from the front and you have to lead from a space that says it is possible.
Mr. Mayor, can I challenge you to be as passionate on that issue?
I don't think I can top that.
Well said, though. Thank you.
No, I agree. But I think we all need to look inside and practice more what we preach. There's no question about it. And maybe younger people are showing us the way. I do think that it is really important to challenge conventional wisdom and to challenge the institutions that have done things one way for a long time. You know, I'm a reader like the senator, and I'm blanking on the title of the book, but there was a tremendous book by a guy who wrote about corporations, which are not bad or evil in any way, but how substitute for real progressive action on behalf of the poor, that we've developed what he called the Davos culture, right? The philanthropy that we're going to get together and brainstorm how we're going to solve these societal problems, while at the same time, the younger generation is in fact challenging the old way. When young African Americans are challenging the invocation of Dr. King, you know there's something else going on there, right? The way we've done it is not necessarily the way that it should be done going forward. And so I'm like Senator Ashby, though. You got to have hope. And my real hope are in young people and in that next generation who will take, I hope, the good things we've done. Look, we're the generation that led so many medical and technological advances. We're the generation that fought for civil rights and marriage equality. Our generation isn't all bad or broken, but it's the next generation that is going to take what we didn't do and change it. And that's the hope. And so, yeah, this book is interesting, a little bit dour. But the question is always, what are we going to do about it together to make it better?
I cannot think of a better way to wrap this conversation up. Thank you both. I am deeply honored that you took the time to read the book. And really, I love how these podcast conversations go, because it's not only a conversation about poverty, but it's also a primer on the dynamics between state and local government and how you work and learn from the experiences and the life that you've had already. So thank you both. Mr. Mayor, good to see you again.
Really wonderful to see you. You're still going strong, man.
I'm still going strong. Senator Ashby, thank you again
Thank
for
you for
your
having
time.
us.
Oh, yeah. We'll do this again soon.
All
Thank
right.
you very much.
Very good.
What's the next book?
The next book? Yeah, well, I won't order it from Amazon, whatever it is.
All right.
And that's a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from John Roman, Brian Shadden, Michelle Baker, McLeana Woods, Michelle Sherwood, Andrew Kehoe, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.